We're very grateful to the South Bank Centre also for giving the event a home. Just to say that my name is Leslie East. I'm a past master of the Worshipful Company of Musicians, and currently I'm Chief Executive of ABRSM, the Music Examinations Board. Just to tell you what will happen today, today's event will consist of an address, presentation by Marshall Marcus, who is the founder and coordinator of Sistemas Europe, a trustee of In Harmony, Sistemas England, and CEO of the European Youth Orchestra. That will be followed by a panel discussion, which Marshall will introduce, and then an open discussion with you, the audience. And there'll be opportunities during the panel discussion for you to contribute as well. I thought I'd just give you a little bit of background to this debate and presentation. For those of you who don't know, the Worshipful Company of Musicians is a 512-year-old City of London livery company. We've been around for a long time, not personally. And it's the only livery company in the City of London that's devoted to a performing art. This is actually the 7th public debate or lecture organised by the Musicians Company. Previous debates and lectures have been dealing with music therapy, jazz, contemporary composition, and developing concert audiences. In 2010, we organised a debate called El Sistema, Will It Translate into English? But as Sistemas has become an increasingly important part of the UK music education scene, we decided that it was time to return to this subject again. Now, one of our other schemes in the Musicians Company is that each year we appoint a distinguished musician as an honorary fellow, and this year's fellow is Marshall Marcus. And as part of his year as honorary fellow, Marshall suggested that we have this event, this debate, this discussion. So we're very grateful to Marshall for joining the company in this way, very grateful for him for setting up this event. I'd like you to welcome Marshall Marcus.
Thank you very much, Leslie. Morning, everybody, and welcome. So, what have we learnt about El Sistema in terms of what it can do in Europe in the last few years? So lessons from the past, patterns for the future. One piece of housekeeping just to say at the beginning that all of these slides are available at the address down at the bottom there, marshallmarcus.wordpress.com. WCM lecture, so if there's anything there you want to pick up on, you don't need to scribble too furiously for the next half hour or so. So, it's an interesting question, this one, and I think Leslie has referred to the debate that went on in January 2010 about the will it translate question for El Sistema. One other direction that actually this whole question has been discussed a lot is in the work of where we are now, which is South Bank Centre, that following from the first appearance in April 2009 of the Simon Bolivar Orchestra here at South Bank Centre. South Bank Centre has really focused in on the question of how bringing a home for El Sistema in London, and has a number of events. The one we did last year, at June 2012, I think there is a visual note from that which is on the blog address I gave you earlier, but which may be outside and was done by Creative Connections, who are now doing the same thing this morning, which is Licia here, who's going to draw what it is that we discussed this morning, and so it leaves us with a nice kind of visual note of what happens. The third place that I see the conversation going on about Sistemas is in the formation of Sistemas Europe, which started in January 2012, and I'll talk about later quite a bit, and which has grown in a year to being a network of about 30 different projects in about 20 different countries. So it's really taken off as an idea. Now, two questions really. There's a kind of variation of questions that are asked. So when the debate happened here with the Worshipful Company last time, the question that was going around was, can the El Sistema model find a way of working in Europe? What would be the translation? Can it translate? But in the last couple of years, as Sistemas have sprung up from, I don't know, the Arctic Circle to North Africa, from the Atlantic to Asia. The question's become much more of people who are actually doing that, not can it work, but how can it work? And actually that's more what I'm going to focus on in the next half hour is how we do that. How actually, what form of translation has been going on. But first of all, what I really would like to do is to, that's by the way the note we had from June 2012 when we invited Sistema members from about 6 or 7 different countries in 3 continents to talk about what was important for them in the way that Sistema works. And again, you can find that image on the blog, the address that I gave earlier. One of the first questions I really want to look at is the extraordinary challenges of the freedom which El Sistema offers. Because it's not like a company like Apple or IBM or one of those companies which, when they expand, they do very well in their country, they go and expand into other countries, they set up their operation. But actually that doesn't work with El Sistema. El Sistema has kind of thrown out the idea of do you want to make it work in your own culture, and basically said do it in whatever way you want. There's no license to apply for, there are no rules, there's no exam, there's no testing, there's no evaluation you have to go through. So anybody who wants, any of you in this room could walk out today and say, I'm going to start a Sistema, and you could call it whatever it would be. Sistema Personal Room. Now that is very generous on their part, it's very interesting, but it also throws up some really quite key challenges. One of the dangers that I see as I've looked around internationally as El Sistema develops is the question of dilution. It's all very well to be in Venezuela and have that project working as it is, but what happens when it comes to other countries, other cultures? How does it manage to work on without being diluted? And I'm going to talk a bit later on about what that dilution is. But first, I'd like to just go through a bit of a kind of reminder thing. What is this El Sistema that we're talking about? I will show some slides in a minute which give to me what I think are the key qualities. But first of all, I wanted to just watch a little bit of a film. It's a German film that was made a couple of years ago. This is just the opening few minutes of the film. The reason I wanted to show it is because I think we often lose the texture, the feel for what this work is really like on the ground. We go and see concerts by Venezuelan orchestras in Europe and we have that kind of feeling. But what's it like at home? What's the real sense of it? So let's just have a look, if we can, at that first DVD, which is the first opening few minutes of this film, which came out about 2 years ago.
Expresa lo invisible, lo inefable, ¿verdad? La hace particularmente fecunda en creatividad. Su misterio, la posibilidad de expresar lo que solamente ella puede expresar y ningún otro arte, la hace prolífica, la hace inmensamente accesible a la sensibilidad más profunda. Además, la música penetra quizá más profundamente en el ser humano que otras artes.
Este carro lo compré en 1975, cuando empezó el sistema. Se ha quedado, nunca lo he pintado. Toda la gente de Caracas conoce este carro. Y cada vez que me ven, ahí está el carro del Frank. La formación de ese sistema no fue fácil. Todos estábamos remando a ciegas. Solamente la fuerza, la perseverancia y creer en el propósito que no sabíamos qué era, lo tenía solamente una sola persona, que es José Antonio Abreu. Él ha sido la única persona que poder mantener esa llama encendida, esa magia de la música y esa esperanza de todos los niños que todavía no han nacido y que puedan tener orquestas infantiles, orquestas juveniles, toda esa atmósfera que se ha creado, toda esa plataforma que hay, gracias a él. Siempre hay una buena ocasión para tirar un cohete. Y en mi casa siempre tengo cohetes para tirar.
Orquesta 22, la capo, a ver, tutti orquesta, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2 y.
Ahora estamos batallando desde el campo del arte para unir esta nueva generación, estos niños, estos jóvenes de toda América Latina, bajo el ideal de la música hacia un continente que sea realmente lo que quería el libertador Simón Bolívar, que fuese la esperanza misma del mundo. Y la música es eso: felicidad, paz, esperanza, integración, fuerza, energía infinita.
El sistema es una familia gigantesca que tiene un padre, que tiene una cabeza, el cual es el maestro José Antonio Abreu, el cual nos ha brindado su vida, pues nos ha brindado esa idea, le dio un cambio a nuestro país, a Venezuela. O sea, el sistema se ha convertido en Venezuela como un símbolo patrio.
Hay una condición del venezolano natural, seguramente, creo yo, es por la parte geográfica. Y de todos los jóvenes, de toda la gente que nace en este país, es una cosa acomodada, como que quiere compartir todo. Y eso es igual la música, o sea, la energía, no solamente aprenderla, poderla transmitir, poderla disfrutar, poderla decir. Si vamos a reír, reímos todos. Si vamos a llorar, lloramos todos. Si vamos a... O sea, es una cosa que nace en nosotros.
Todo el mundo en Venezuela ama la música. Le gusta el baile, le gusta cantar, le gusta música popular, música muy culta, música muy académica, música, digamos, extraída de las entrañas mismas de la comunidad.
No solamente que tocamos, se canta, se vive, se expresa, se siente. Hay muchas condiciones que la música te da para disfrutar.
So, welcome to a nice Latin party on a Friday morning. there are a number of issues we can get into which come out of that clip. There's all sorts of stuff about Latin culture, which I think it will be interesting to talk about later as we look at Europe. But however, I want to just alight for a moment on what are the values and methodology which are behind that. I'm very quickly going to show about 20 slides now, which are all things to me which I think are absolutely key in that. One of the first things, and again we'll get into an interesting conversation I feel about this later, is the focus on social change. This is not fundamentally a music education project. It's a project which is about the development of people, of us, as we grow. And for that reason, people have often taken it that it doesn't really matter how well or badly you play the music, but that's not the case. Here's a group from South Africa called Buscade, who don't call themselves a Sistema, but they very much use the principles, and musical excellence is at the core. So any Sistema work that happens in Europe, which doesn't have excellence at the core, even though it might be a social development project, I think would be something that I would really question. Accessibility. Whenever a Sistema opens in Venezuela, it opens in a place for everybody in that locality, and the notion of the openness and the accessibility, this is a Sistema I think in Juneau in Alaska, is something which is a really key side of that. Special needs, again, whoever you are, if you have the Sistema in your area, it's open for everybody, whatever you bring in the way of ability or disability. And that's something which is a very key thing that runs through certainly all the nucleos I've seen in Venezuela. Start young. Here's an orchestra of 3 to 5-year-olds in Barquisimeto in Venezuela, and a few minutes after I took that photo, every chair was filled. There was a little string section, a little woodwind section, brass, percussion. There's an orchestra there of about 80 3 to 5-year-olds. We have to think what happens to those kids when they are 13 to 15, and they've already been playing together as an orchestra for 10 years. It's an irony that you might go and hear an orchestra in Venezuela play when they're 15-year-olds, they may have been playing more together than when you go and hear the Vienna Philharmonic, which might have more a change over the years. And there is something which Gustavo Dudamel refers to in that film as the family, a kind of family feel and a collective feel. One of the things I think is not always understood is the way in which, because it's not a fixed system, El Sistema, but a developing idea, it's very much open for change and development. And this is a picture of what's known as the paper orchestra, which began as how do we cope with not having enough instruments in Venezuela, and they decided one way was to actually make them out of wood and paper and plastic to begin with, so they're often a child will play in a paper orchestra to begin with for a year. And then they noticed when they did that actually it was a fantastic bonding process for how families work together when a child works within El Sistema. So that's just an example. There is a father and son, I think in LA in California, who are making their first instrument that will be his first instrument. Lack of fear of failure is a massively important difference that I see. Frank DiPolo, the guy with the car at the beginning of that film, he talks about this very well, I think, and there's this kind of naturalness that Venezuelans and a lot of Latins have with the way they are and the way they live, compared with us. I grew up in a culture of playing, I'm a violinist, which was about make sure you don't go wrong in the concert. And I think that informs a massive amount of our cultural output and our work, so that fear of failure. That picture is of a boy who I was teaching the group there, which is in Caracas, in the middle of Caracas, in one of the nucleos, and I had a baroque bow, and he looked at it and he said, "What's that?" And I said, well, I explained what it was, and I said, "Try it." And very few children would play in front of their peers with something rather odd like a baroque bow that works in a very different way, because they'd be worried about could they do that in front of their friends. No fear of failure there. Joy, again, is something which Frank refers to in the film, and it's so endemic there. And I see so many worthy projects which just lack that kind of flame of happiness, because we're so desperate that we do good work with children and we make sure they're working. And that sense of joy and fun, it just seems to be a birthright in Venezuela, actually compared with many other Latin American countries, I would say as well. This picture is actually of paper orchestra instruments in Hawaii, but the colours just remind me of that feeling, that natural feeling of joy in Venezuela. The nucleo is the place where children start to work in El Sistema. It's usually a building that has no other use, So it's not a school, it's not a collective arts centre, but it's the place where you come and you do the work with El Sistema. And what it means is that the Nucleo can establish its own culture, its own way of being. It doesn't have to take the culture. Today, we're in the South Bank Centre, we're in the Purcell Room. This place, these spaces, dictate partly the kind of the balance of the way that we will have our conversation. In a Nucleo, they create their own. The woman in that picture is Carmen at the Guarenas Nucleo just outside Caracas, and she's, you know, typical. People who live half their life within the Nucleo. Teachers, another really important area here, and again, I think Venezuela has this thing where, I think Maestro Brea has a saying, which is that the person who plays 3 notes is the teacher to the person who only plays 2 notes. And I think they have much less formal, I mean, we were talking earlier about, before you arrived, I was talking to some of the panel about a kind of rigidity and of the way that some of the systems work with El Sistema and elsewhere. But one way that it doesn't is that today you're a teacher, tomorrow you may be a learner, and I think that's something that drives through their thing. So peer teaching, here's a child, actually again in Yola in Los Angeles, who's teaching somebody who's a similar but probably slightly earlier age how to hold the wooden bow there, and that peer teaching is a very important thing. And it means, I think they're much less hung up there about the idea of what your status is. Here I always feel that. Are you the teacher or are you the learner is a much more rigid kind of structure. Ensemble learning is absolutely key. Again, unlike many projects in the West, I think Venezuela is about, it's not about learning your instrument, it's about learning how you play together. Learning to play together is something that happens immediately and runs through the entire program. Frequency is a really big challenge for in Europe. Most of the kids in this picture, which is I think taken in Coro in Venezuela, will be coming at around 2 o'clock in the afternoon, 6 days a week to the Nucleo, and they'll be there probably for 4 hours. So 24 hours a week is the basic for a lot of Nucleos, most of them really, if not all. And I think there's a huge question for us with our institutional arrangements. How can you hope to make a really deep progress if you're doing 3, 4, 5 hours a week in comparison? Performance is again a hugely, any excuse in Venezuela. It doesn't matter if anybody's visiting, whatever the reason, you just go out and perform. And that means that you're used to performing. Performing isn't one of those things that you have to be worried and nervous about doing. Community involvement is another huge area. There's Gustavo in La Vega in Caracas. When he does a concert there for the people, it's not like something that's been parachuted in. These people who are coming out to watch feel a kind of ownership of what's going on. Social cohesion leads to a lot of the projects, I would say, giving a kind of social fluency to the players. Here's the Venezuelan violinist who, I think in 2012, just last year, was taken on the ballroom of the festival hall, talking to one of the players in Lambeth in Harmony. And the last thing, I just want to look at a few areas of inspired leadership. I mean, obviously, Jose Antonio Abreu, who's the director, who's the funder, the starter of this project, founder, sorry, not founder. Hugely important person. Latin America has a massively different attitude to leadership. I think we're much more, perhaps justifiably, suspicious of the notion of the leader here in this country, and that gives us some areas of concern. Then there's the question of the artistic leader, and again, without Gustavo Dudamel, it's quite interesting to hypothesize where El Sistema would be today. This is actually a graffiti painting of him in Caracas, rather cleverly done up. I don't know, are there any Venezuelans here? Because any here might notice that he's been deliberately painted as Simón Bolívar, the national leader of Venezuela. If you go around in Venezuela, everybody knows Gustavo. If I get stopped in the airport by somebody with a machine gun to actually look at my violin and see whether I've got drugs in it, I make sure to mention Gustavo. Within a minute, we've got a conversation going. So that kind of leadership runs through. Also, in every single Nucleo you go to, you will find really inspired leaders on the ground working. This is Jesus Rodriguez in Mérida, in Venezuela, in the mountains. And every Nucleo has these people. It's very interesting the way that El Sistema in Venezuela has kind of got that leadership to come through. We're a little more, again, rigid, I think, in the way that we allow our leaders through. Here is in Harmony Lambeth playing on the ballroom of the festival hall, and the conductor is Simi, who's a cellist who just started through Lambeth, and who was allowed and given a kind of space for leading, which I think is typical of the way that it works. I'm not going to go through too much of this. I put down 10 quick facts on El Sistema. I just wanted to point to the last 2 or 3 of those, which are relating to the point I made before about how it works in Europe, because the fact is that of the 100 or so countries that have Sistemas now, I think they're estimated to be around 1 million children throughout the globe in El Sistema projects. Not a single one of them is in a Sistema started by Venezuela, and that's where our challenge begins. So meanwhile in Europe, here are some current members of Sistema Europe, and here including now others which are kind of beginning to work on projects. So, you know, you've got around 30 projects there, as I say, in about 20 countries. How are they doing? I just want to quickly outline 4 different models that I think have arisen with El Sistema in Europe. The first I'm looking at is well represented, I think, by Big Noise in Scotland, which is what I call the pure model, because it's a very heterogeneous, homogeneous society of people, it's a white working class estate in Raploch, in Stirling, who are part of the Sistema. And I think that focus is very similar in Venezuela. These people know who they are, they know their culture, they know each other. So it gives a kind of advantage to following, let's say, the pure rather diluted version of El Sistema because of that. Here's a mixed model, England. Very different. So you have something which began fundamentally as a government offer of funds, inviting people to bid for the funds. So it's an entire inversion of the way it happened in Venezuela and in Scotland. It didn't start with people who said, I'm going to do it, and they went on and did it. It started with the government saying, here is some money, who wants to apply for this? And so we have the 6 In Harmony projects, which are currently funded by the Department for Education and the Arts Council England, and then there's also Norwich, the 7th, that was originally part of the In Harmony project. There are other projects as well in England. So what's happening in England is a kind of, do we recognise this in England? A sort of growing up bits and pieces, different ways of doing it, some funding from government, but a kind of plurality rather than purity, I would say, about the way it works. There's another interesting model which began in Austria, which is Super Art. And it mainly works through singing, but it's spread to about 5 or 6 countries now, and it particularly is spreading towards Eastern Europe, to Bosnia, to Slovakia, to countries of that sort. And it's a kind of franchise. It's a franchise in the way that El Sistema is not a franchise internationally. So Super A have begun their way of working, and they've offered it to people in these countries, and all of those countries that are doing it are part of the Super A area. The last one I want to talk about is what I call the Latin model, which is something that's begun in Turkey. And I'm going to play you a clip now, if I can get the technology for this worked out. And the clip is of these kids playing. Now, I think I see Etienne in the audience, who is from Super A Switzerland. Etienne, am I right that in this clip, the kids who you'll hear have been playing for 4 months?
Most of them, yes.
Most of them. What kind of percentage would you say?
60-70%.
Right. So this is what can happen in Turkey after these kids have been going for 4 months, most of them. And I think it raises some really interesting questions. Let's see if I can make it work. surprise people, that clip. Some people just think it's the most wonderful thing they've seen, and others think it's out of tune, it's battling rhythm, what are these kids doing, jumping up and down? Looks to me like the future of classical music, I must say. So these programs run through various different ways of structuring themselves, some through orchestras, community centres, opera companies that I've been talking about so far, and that's one of the questions. But I just want to be a little bit polemical for a moment and say, what are some of the challenges that we face in Europe? We're emotionally cold, we're initiative saturated, funding deprived, excessively affluent would need a bit of explanation what I mean by that, but I'll say it for the moment. Process obsessed, failure fearing, highly rigid, risk averse, change phobic, unduly hasty, massively short term and timetable challenged. What makes us think we could possibly reproduce it here in Europe? And I think those are all questions that need answering. And I divide them into different areas, and it might be something we'll get onto later, which is, it's that cultural difference, the contextual difference. Abreu began the Sistema in the 1970s, which were a period of huge financial expansion in Venezuela. There was, for those of us that will remember, it was the first Gulf crisis, the 70s. As 90% of Venezuelans' exports of petrol, they became massively rich in the 70s. He had immense luck, you might say, or planning, I don't know which, to start up then. We're in a very different period now. Many sistemas in Europe are between 0 and 4 years, 5 years old, and they've had to grow in a kind of period which is much more difficult as a funding challenge. Institutionally, of course, is also extremely challenging. Abreu began with what I call the vacuum model. When he started in Venezuela with El Sistema in 1975, there was nothing else. There was nothing else going on. Even now, if I go and teach in a town like Valle de la Pascua in Venezuela, El Sistema is the only show in town when it comes to something culturally interesting, stimulating that's going on, specifically designed for young people. So I think there are some challenges. Of course, there are some strengths. There are some fantastic people throughout Europe who are working on Sistemas. There's a kind of idealism, a passion, a commitment to make this thing work. So there is a kind of balance. One of my last couple of slides now, the question here is, what's the translation going on? If the Worshipful Company's last lecture was, what was it called? Something about, can it translate? I'm always interested with Sistema people to ask in Europe, what's the verb that describes what you're trying to do? Are you transposing? Are you trying to emulate? Are you recreating? These are very different and very important questions to me in seeing what we're trying to achieve with the project. And so, lastly, I just want to leave with this idea. There's 4 areas, if we're really looking to the future. One is somehow we have to find a way of encouraging the inspirational leadership without which I'm sure no El Sistema project can really succeed. Because of how we live in Europe and the UK as an example, I think the notion of partnership is going to be absolutely key. It's quite interesting that yesterday and the day before there were announcements of a new structure for Lambeth in Harmony, the London in Harmony Sistema project, which henceforth will be partly housed here at South Bank Centre, and in a sense, South Bank Centre, with all its wealth of resource, as well as challenges here, will now begin to take over and work with In Harmony in Lambeth. And I think most of the Sistemas will need partnerships of this sort to actually make these work. I didn't plan to do this talk one day after the announcement, but it happened. For me, maybe the most important aspect is what I guess is the most difficult for us, which is learning a little bit from the culture of Latin America. I see quite a lot of arrogant xenophobia when we talk about Sistema in Europe. A lot of people in the UK take the position, we don't need this here. We have an amazing range of music education projects, which is true. This country has probably got the most diverse, imaginative, creative set of music education work that's grown up over the last quarter of a century. And I think one has to have respect for that. And the question is how we work together. But I would suggest that if we're not prepared to relax a little bit and Latinize a little bit, I don't see that this will work with the same depth and power. And finally, I think we've really got to find models that are scalable. I know Pam is probably going to talk about sustainability in a minute. And one other aspect of sustainability to me is not just can you manage to retain your Sistema of 10, 20, 30, 50, 100, 300 kids. I think, I see Richard Howell and Dick Hallam in the audience. Dick, how many kids are doing youth orchestra work in this country?
Well, in total,
it's
well over 1 million.
Yeah. So I think that one of the challenges here is if Sistema is going to really work, how does it scale itself where it can really respond well to a mass of kids, not just to the ones who seem to be able to come into the 6 or 7 or 10, however many projects we manage to make in the next few years. There is an interesting essay by a man called Eric Booth from the States called The Generous Laboratory, which I've put a link to it on the website address I gave earlier. And he tried to engage in the States with that very question, which is how do you scale this up? And he suggests a kind of model for how that can be done. So, I think that's probably enough about Sistema and ranting about the way we need to become Latin in this country. I think it's now a kind of moment to move on to the next part of the morning.